The title of the sermon today is, Why Did King Saul Fail? Now we all know that he failed. But why? Does the Bible tell us why? Does the Bible give us reasons why? Well, in fact, there are quite a number of recorded transgressions Saul has committed, one leading to the next. And as Mr. Mitchell said recently in a message, even though I have them all written down, I'm not going to tell you at this point how many I'm going to address, because I may not get to all of them. But I hope I will. And it's quite a few. You might be thinking perhaps of one or two or three. It's quite a few. But let's turn first to 1 Samuel chapter 8, where the story begins. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we find that Israel wanted a king, a human king. They were not satisfied anymore with God ruling and leading them, and they looked at outward circumstances. And it appeared like they were justified, humanly speaking, with their request. That's how it appeared. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 3. They come to Samuel saying, or rather it says here, Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. And then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make for us a king to judge us, like all the nations. Samuel warned them that the consequences of having a king would be very bad for them, disastrous for them. It was never God's will that they should have a king. But they demanded one. And so we read in verse 19, after Samuel gave them the warning, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, No, but we will have a king over us. Notice the motive, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That was the reason. Now Samuel is told by God, you go ahead, you do it. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me, God says. And so Samuel anoints Saul as king. And the story goes on in 1 Samuel chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. And there was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, dropping down at the end of the verse, a Benjaminite, a mighty man of power. Verse 2. And he had a son whose name was Saul. Notice how he is being described, a choice and handsome young man. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. A tremendously good-looking guy. Did it help him? Verse 15. Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear the day before Saul came, saying, Tomorrow about this time I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him commander over my people Israel, that he may save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. And when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, There he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people. So it was clear that God now inspired Samuel to anoint Saul as king. Verse 21. Saul is being described here as a very humble person. Saul answered and said, Am I not a Benjaminite or a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me? In other words, why do you want to make me king? A very humble attitude he had. Well, let's go down to chapter 10, verse 1. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, "Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance?" Dropping down to verse 6. Notice what happened. "And then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with them and be turned into another man." When we receive God's Holy Spirit, we should be turned into other people, a new creation, a new man. And this was said to Saul. That would happen to him. Verse 7, "And let it be, when these signs come to you, that you do as the occasion demands, for God is with you, and you shall go down before me to Gilgal, and surely I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and make sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days you shall wait till I come to you and show you what you should do." And so it was, when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, that God gave him another heart. See, he had received the Holy Spirit. He received another heart. And all those signs came to pass that day. And when they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. And then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened, when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets, that the people said to one another, "What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" And then a man from there answered and said, "But who is our father?" And therefore it became a proverb, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" Now we come back to that later, because it happened again. "And when he had finished prophesying, he went to the high place, and then Saul's uncle said to him and his servants, 'Where did you go?' And he said, 'To look for the donkeys, because donkeys had escaped.' And when he saw that they were nowhere to be found, we went to Samuel. And Saul's uncle said, 'Tell me, please, what Samuel said to you.' And so Saul said to his uncle, 'He told us plainly that donkeys had been found. But about the matter of the kingdom, he did not tell him what Samuel had said.'" Why not? He was still not sure. Is that really what is supposed to be my fate? Maybe it was because of the humility he had. He didn't want to even say that he was supposed to become king over Israel. And then Saul is publicly even proclaimed king. So now it became known to everybody. We read that in 1 Samuel chapter 10, beginning in verse 19. Again, Samuel warns the Israelites, even before he publicly proclaims Saul as king. He says, "You have today rejected your God." See, your demand of having a human king means you have rejected God. That's something we got to understand. You have rejected God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations, and you have said to him, "No, but set a king over us." Now therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. And when Samuel had caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin was chosen. And when he had caused the tribe of Benjamin to come near by their families, the family of Massacre was chosen. And Saul, the son of Kish, was chosen. And when they sought him, he couldn't be found. He couldn't be found. And therefore they inquired of the Lord further, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord answered, "There he is, hidden among the equipment." And so they ran and brought him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upwards. And Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen, that there is no one like him among the people?" And so all the people shouted and said, "Long live the king." As they still do in some countries today, "Long live the king, long live the queen." You see, again, he was afraid. He was hiding. He didn't want to take the position. He was very humble. He felt lowly in his heart. He didn't want to believe it. So if he had only stayed that way, he would have been probably one of the most powerful kings and spiritual giants in the Bible. But it didn't work out that way. Let's go to the first transgression. We call that Saul's unlawful sacrifice. Remember, Samuel had told him, wait 7 days, and then I will come and bring sacrifice to God. But you see, outward circumstances seem to have dictated that Saul had to do something, right? Couldn't wait for Samuel. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 13, beginning in verse 5. 1 Samuel 13 and verse 5. Then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and encamped in Michmash to the east of Bethaven. And when the men of Israel saw that they were in danger, for the people were distressed, then the people hid in caves and thickets and rocks and holes and pits. And some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. And as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And then he waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And so Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offering here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Of course, he didn't have the authority to do that. And now it happened, verse 10, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, that Samuel came. If he had only waited a little bit longer. But no, he thought he had to do something right then and right there. He was afraid people would run away from him and he would be defeated in war. And so Saul went out to meet him, and that he might greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord, and therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. Sounds pretty good. Based on human reasoning, or look at all the terrible circumstances, he had to do something, right? So he took matters in his own hand, against God's command. Verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Notice that. He would have been king forever. Now he goes on to say, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. There was a big problem in the character of Saul, as we will see when we go through, and he was never able to overcome that problem. He wanted to take matters in his own hands. He wanted to decide what had to be done, not what God told him to do, which brings us to the second transgression, which I call Saul's foolish vow. Saul's foolish vow. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 14, beginning in verse 24. Again, he had to do something, so he thought, in the light of danger. 1 Samuel 14, verse 24. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, cursed is a man who eats any food until evening, because I have taken vengeance on my enemies. So none of the people tasted food. And now all the people of the land came to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people had come into the woods, there was the honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan, Saul's son, had not heard his father charge the people with the oath. Therefore he stretched out the hand, or the end of the rod that was in his hand, and dipped it in a honeycomb, and put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. And then one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed is a man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. Couldn't fight, were faint, because of that foolish vow which Saul had made. And Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance has brightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of the enemies, which they found, for now would there not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines. Now they had driven back the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ayalon, and so the people were very faint. Now it drops down to verse 36. Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. And then the priest said, let us draw near to God. Here, see, Saul didn't even think about that first. And so Saul asked counsel of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the hand of Israel? But he didn't answer him that day. And Saul said, come over here, all you chiefs of the people, and know and see what this sin was today. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, another foolish statement comes, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. All right, then of course it is revealed that Jonathan was the one who had eaten the honey. Verse 44. And Saul answered, God do so and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. So he was willing to kill his own son, as he was willing to kill his son again in the future, as we will see. And the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great salvation in Israel? Certainly not. And as the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. And so the people rescued Jonathan, and he didn't die. You see, even here, Saul is not that strong leader, even though it would have been a foolish thing to do, but he listened to the people, as he would always listen to the people when it seemed to his advantage. But it was a foolish vow. It was a foolish statement to make. It was a foolish act all along. And that brings us to the third transgression. Saul spares King Agag and the best of the flock. Now that is probably the one which we are most familiar with. 1 Samuel chapter 15, beginning in verse 1. Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish what Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him on the way when he came up from Egypt. See, they would wait until Israel had crossed and had passed, and then they would attack those in the back, the women, the children, wipe them out. And so it says in verse 3, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both men and women, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. That sounds kind of cool to us today, but we got to understand the situation. Amalek was to be destroyed, and it would have been not that logical to keep little children alive, because what would happen to them? God knew he would always resurrect them again in the second resurrection. But that was the charge which was given to Saul. Now Saul had no problem with the charge. That was not his problem. Verse 7. So Saul attacked the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He also took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people, it says, spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them. But they were saying despised and worthless. Well, that they utterly destroyed. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me, and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. And when Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul went to Carmel, and indeed he set up a monument, notice this, for himself. He began to become extremely proud. and he has gone on around, passed by, and gone down to Gilgal. And Samuel sent to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed are you of the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Was it self-deception? Was he trying to cover up? Samuel said, What then is the bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear? And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen. Well, he did too, didn't he? To sacrifice to the Lord your God. Okay, now that made it all right? So in other words, we did it for God. And the rest we have utterly destroyed. And Samuel said to Saul, Be quiet, and I will tell you what the Lord said to me last night. And he said to him, Speak on. And Samuel said, When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel when you were little in your own eyes, when you had the necessary humility? Now the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? And Saul said to Samuel, But I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I have utterly destroyed the Amalekites, but the people, they took of the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God, in Gilgal. And Samuel said, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? You see, today, many times we think, we can just circumvent some of the commandments of God because that's the way we need to do it under those conditions. And maybe we do it for God, right? He says, Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and adultery. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also rejected you from being king. And then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. Well, did he really think that way? Was he really repentant? I say not. I mean, he saw the consequences of his action, so he wanted to do something to sugarcoat it. I have sinned. I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, because he saw it wasn't true repentance here. I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And as Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe, and it tore. And so Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. Talking about David, a man after God's own heart, who also sinned, sometimes very, very seriously. But the difference was, David would repent once he found out. Saul did not. Not really. Notice what Saul's reaction was. Verse 29, And also the strength of Israel will not lie nor relent, for he is not a man that he should relent. And then he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel. That's what he wanted to be seen. And return with me, that I may worship the Lord your God. And so Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshipped the Lord. Notice verse 35. And Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. Nevertheless, Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. You see, we mourn when people leave the church, when people leave us, but there comes a time when there is no longer any connection. You see, Samuel clearly saw Saul was rejected by God. He would not see him again. He mourned about this whole situation. But he saw in Saul's heart he was lacking the character necessary to be a true follower of God. And notice what happens. 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 14. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. See, now God takes the Holy Spirit away from the person. And not only that, a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. So now God allows even that a demon comes to trouble King Saul. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp, and it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. And so Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Verse 21. And so David came to Saul and stood before him. This was God's way of getting David to the court, because after all, David would become the next king. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And then Saul sent to Jesse, his father, David's father, saying, please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was. Whenever the Spirit from God, not that God sent that spirit, but God allowed it, but you see, he allowed it for a reason, because this demon had to fulfill a purpose in the plan of God, so that David would come to the court. So whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand, and then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him, which is very interesting, because we have a similar account with Adolf Hitler, who, when he was plagued by a distressing spirit, when he heard music, then it got better with him. So something very similar happened here with Saul, but now we come to the fourth transgression. Because now Saul becomes envious and suspicious of David. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 18. First he loved him greatly, we read. But that love didn't last long. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 5. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And now it happened, as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. And so the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. The word eyed can be translated as looking with him or at him with suspicion. It can be translated as he envied him. It all means the same thing. He was becoming angry, he was full of envy, and he became full of suspicion about David. Verse 10. And it happened on the next day. You see, now he becomes angry, he becomes suspicious, he becomes full of anger. It happened the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. And so David played music with his hands, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hands. You see, this is now his attempt, Saul's attempt to kill David. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall with it. But David escaped his presence twice. And now Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people, and David behaved wisely in all his ways. And the Lord was with him, and therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. You see, he became envious, he became suspicious, he was willing to kill David as a consequence. He saw that David was protected by God, and became more and more afraid of David. And that brings us to the fifth transgression. Saul makes promises which he breaks. Have you ever heard of people who make all kinds of promises and then break them? Something wrong with the character of a person like that. Notice 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning at verse 17. Maybe that is not an episode which is very well known, but it's very clearly revealed here. 1 Samuel 18, verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." And so David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" Verse 19. But it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Meholathite, as a wife. So here, Saul had promised that his older daughter would be given to David as his wife, but then he broke that promise. Which leads us to the sixth transgression. Now Saul tries to kill David through the hand of the Philistines. And we read that in 1 Samuel chapter 18, beginning in verse 20. Because now the other daughter of Saul is introduced, Michal, however you pronounce that. Now, I say Michal because I believe that's how the Hebrew would pronounce it. I don't know how the Americans do. So Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Why? Because now he found a way, he thought, to get rid of David. So Saul said, "I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Why should she be a snare? Well, because Saul had a plan how he could use her. And therefore Saul said to David a second time, "You shall be my son-in-law today." And Saul commanded his servants, "Communicate with David secretly and say, 'Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law.'" And so Saul's servants spoke those words in the hearing of David. And David said, "Does it seem to you a light thing to be a king's son-in-law, seeing I'm a poor and lightly esteemed man?" And the servants of Saul told him, saying, "In this manner David spoke." And Saul said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies." But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And so when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and they killed 200 men of the Philistines. It shows a little bit of David's character, which he had to deeply repent of. He was a man of war too, and he had to learn that war was not what he should be really glory in. So he didn't have to kill 200 Philistines, but he did. That was his nature, his carnal nature, which he had to get rid of. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full account to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And so Saul gave him Michal as his daughter, or his daughter as a wife. And Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. And so Saul became David's enemy continually. Notice this, continually. Verse 30, and then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. But you see, his plan backfired. He thought he could kill David through the Philistines. David showed himself much more powerful, and now Saul becomes David's enemy continually. Which leads us to the 7th transgression of Saul, Saul's plan to kill David. You know, he never gave up the thought he had to kill David, his enemy. 1 Samuel 19, verse 1. Now Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. So he talks to his son and all his servants. Now you kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. He didn't want to do it. And so again, this goes now to the 8th transgression. Because now Saul makes another oath. He says, I will not kill David. Of course, he would break his word again. 1 Samuel 19, verse 4. Now Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant, against David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his works have been very good toward you. Verse 5, for he took his life in his hands and killed the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood to kill David without a cause? And so Saul heeded the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be killed. Another promise, which of course wasn't worth the paper on it was written, so to speak, because it was an oral promise, we understand. Verse 7. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. And so Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as in times past. And there was war again, and David went out and fought with the Philistines and struck them with a mighty blow, and they fled from him. Now, verse 8 or verse 9, the distressing spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with a spear in his hand, and David was playing music with his hand. Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear, again trying to kill him. But he slipped away from Saul's presence, and he drove the spear into the wall. And so David fled and escaped that night. And Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. And so Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image, in other words, a household god. So we see, in that household, they didn't only worship God at all. So he took an image and laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with cloth. And so when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. And then Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. Now, didn't he make a promise before that he wouldn't kill him? And when the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. And Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this, and sent my enemy away, so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? Because that was a lie too. So it wasn't a necessarily very righteous household, so to speak. But you see again, here's Saul trying to do whatever he can to kill David. His word meant nothing. Now, if we go further a little bit to reach the 9th transgression, and then we come back here, go to 1 Samuel 25 with me. 1 Samuel 25, and let's just read verse 44. Now remember, Michal was David's wife. But in 1 Samuel 25 and verse 44, I'll call that now the 9th transgression. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. So he has taken David's wife and just gave the wife to somebody else. In other words, he stole, if you please, what belonged to David. But the interesting thing is, after all this happened, we find an interesting episode that even then, when it serves God's purpose, God's Spirit would still work with Saul on one occasion. Now remember now, the Holy Spirit had left Saul. God had taken the Holy Spirit away from him. A distressing spirit, a demon, had been plaguing Saul, but there was a time where God had to intervene. And notice this now in 1 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 20. Because here is Saul again, who's trying to kill David. Then Saul sent messengers to take David. And when they saw the group of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as leader over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. We're reading 1 Samuel 19, now verse 21. And when Saul was told, he sent other messengers, and they prophesied likewise. And then Saul sent messengers again the third time, and they prophesied also. And then he also went to Ramah and came to the great well that is at Zechu. And so he asked and said, "Where are Samuel and David?" And someone said, "Indeed, they are at Naioth in Ramah." And so he went there to Naioth in Ramah, and then the Spirit of God was upon him, didn't enter him, was upon him, motivated him, you see. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he also stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, lay down naked all that day and that night. And therefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Now this happened because God wanted to show that Saul had no basis, no way, no hope, right, to get to David to kill him. But Saul never got that message. And so that leads us now to the 10th transgression. Now Saul is willing to kill again his own son Jonathan. He was trying to kill him before when he had eaten the honey. Now he gets so enraged about Jonathan because Jonathan is trying to help David that he is willing to kill Jonathan. 1 Samuel chapter 20, beginning in verse 27. So Saul expected David to come to a banquet, verse 27, and it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to eat either yesterday or today?" I mean, here is Saul trying to kill him, right? And Jonathan answered Saul, of course that's a lie, "David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem." And he said, "Please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city. My brother has commanded me to be there. And now, if I have found favor in your eyes, please let me get away and see my brothers." And therefore he has not come to the king's table. Now, of course, Saul saw through that, verse 30, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Now, I mean, we have sometimes today wordings like that. We don't want to use them. But it shows the anger Saul had. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Other translations have it, "You son of a whore. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." And Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, "Why should he be killed? What has he done?" And then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, Jonathan, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had treated him shamefully. You see how Saul's downfall leads from one transgression to the next. None of that had to happen. None of that had to happen. But Saul made the conscious decisions, one after the other, to transgress against God, his commandments, giving in to his anger, to his envy, to his hatred, and he was willing to kill and murder his son David, and as we will see now, many more people. Because now we come to the 11th transgression, which is described in 1 Samuel chapter 22, beginning in verse 6. Now, Saul had reached a point of almost like mental instability, to put it mildly. And so we read in 1 Samuel 22 and verse 6, when Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand. Why would he have that spear in his hand? He had become an extremely violent, angry, mad person. And all his servants were standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me." It wasn't true at all. Nobody had conspired against him, but he saw conspiracy all over. People today see conspiracies all over, believe in conspiracy theories all over the place. It is a product of a unsound mind, to put it mildly. So you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is no one of you who is sorry for me, poor man, or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me. None of that was true. To lie in wait, as it is this day. And then answered Doeg the Edomite. Of course, we know that the Edomites today can be found in Turkey. So here's this Doeg, the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, "I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Abimelech, priest. And he inquired of the Lord for him," verse 10, "gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. And then the king sent to call Abimelech, or Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. And they all came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here am I, Lord." And then Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me?" Again, he hadn't. Was totally innocent. But Saul felt they had to have conspired against him. He says, "You and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait, as it is this day." So Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding, is honorable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me, let not the king impute anything to his servant, or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." And then the king said to the guards who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and didn't tell it to me." But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. They wouldn't want to do that. And so the king said to this Doeg, "Now you turn, and you kill the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. And also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword. I mean, the guy became completely, totally insane. So he struck the city with the edge of the sword. Both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep, with the edge of the sword. And now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. You know, it's amazing what can happen when this avalanche starts. How did it start? With pride. Humility was missing, was lacking, and then it led and went from there. A terrible story, but it's not even the end of it yet, because let's go to the 12th transgression. And here we find that even David spares Saul's life. And even though Saul seems to have understood that David means no harm, and so Saul leaves him in peace, he still returns to kill David. You see, his mind had become completely insane. Do you know people like that today? Who at one time began on the wrong foot, I should say on the right foot, and then something happened to them. That's a warning to all of us. Make sure that we are not even anywhere near to making the mistakes Saul has made. 1 Samuel 24, beginning in verse 1. Now it happened, when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. And Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats, because he was willing to capture him to kill him. And so he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs, and David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. And then the men of David said to him, This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hands, that you may do to him as it seems good to you. And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And now it happened afterwards that David's heart troubled him, because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So he wouldn't even kill Saul under those circumstances. Now, he said later, let the Lord deal with him. He might die in a war or something, but it's not going to be me who's going to do it. So David restrained, verse 7, his servants with these words, and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. And David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and called out to Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stood with his face to the earth and bowed down. Let's go down to verse 16. So it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, he was telling him, Hey, look, I haven't done anything wrong to you. I don't have any bad intentions. Saul said, Is it your voice, my son David? You didn't even know. And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And then he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. You see how his mind sometimes switches back and forth? Really no consistency whatsoever. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you surely shall be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. And so David swore to Saul, and Saul went home. But David and his men went up to the stronghold. That's the happy ending, right, of the story. Well, it's not. It's not at all. It was only very temporary. 1 Samuel chapter 26, beginning in verse 1. Now the Ziphites, whoever that is, came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is David not hiding the hill of Hachilah, which is opposite Jeshimon? And then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him, to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph, not in order to greet him, to kill him, after all these things which happened. But he had gotten completely insane because of his madness, because of his anger, his wrath, his willingness to destroy. Had become a total tool in Satan's hands, who is the destroyer. And so we read in verse 7. David and Abishai came to the people by night, because now they were all sleeping. Saul and the soldiers, they were all sleeping in that camp. And there Saul lay sleeping within the camp, with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. And Abner and the people lay all around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has delivered your enemy into your hands this day. Now therefore please let me strike him at once with a spear right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time. And David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said furthermore, as the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please take now the spear and the jug of water. They are by his head, and let us go. And so David took the spear and the jug of water by Saul's head, and they got away, and no man saw it or knew it or awoke, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. See, that was a test for David too. God wanted to see, would David go through with it and kill his enemy or not? And David passed that test. He wouldn't do it. He said, no, I let God take care of it. Verse 17. Now Saul awakes. He realizes what's happening. David talks to him. Then Saul knew David's voice and said, is that your voice, my son David? And David said, it's my voice, my Lord, O king. Verse 21, and Saul said, I have sinned. Well, he said that before. Return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. Well, of course, David did not go with him. He didn't trust him that much. It is true that this is the last time, from what we read, that Saul was trying to kill David, but not because he had a change of heart, because he had no more opportunity. Because now we come to the 13th transgression, and I actually have 13 transgressions listed in my notes. And that is the one which sealed his fate completely. Let's go with me to 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 3. We had read earlier that Saul was actually told, or you can read it in chapter 27, that David had fled to Gath and Saul would not pursue him anymore, because actually that wasn't the place Saul wanted to go. He had to do with the Philistines. But now notice what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 3. Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him and buried him in Ramah in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Now, it's interesting that he would have done that. Maybe in his attempt to perhaps show the people that he was still worshiping God to an extent. But, verse 4, the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped at Shunem. And so Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gibeah. And when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid. His heart trembled greatly. And then Saul inquired of the Lord. Interesting. In his desperation, the Lord didn't answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets, because God saw there was no genuineness in this man. He was doing it at this time because he was in despair, but there was no lasting character trait at all in him anymore. Look what happened. Verse 7. Saul said to his servants, find me a man who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And the servants said to him, in fact, there is a woman who is a medium, or a witch, at Endor. And so Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes. And he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, please conduct a seance for me, and bring up for me the one I shall name to you. Now the warning here is very clear: never ever get involved in something like that. People have gotten involved in seances, and they are still live the consequences today. Because you conduct seances, you get involved in this, and you are asking demons to get involved in your lives. Verse 9. The woman said to him, look, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the Medians and the Spiritists from the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, he goes to a witch, right? And he swears to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. And the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. Now Samuel was a prophet. He had died. God said he wasn't answering him, Saul, anymore, even through the voice of prophets. So whoever is coming up now isn't Samuel. That should be clear. It goes on to say, verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel. See, Saul saw nothing. The woman saw something. It appeared to her that it was Samuel. It wasn't Samuel, it was a demon, pretending to be Samuel. So when the woman saw, quote unquote, Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me, for you are Saul? And the king said to her, do not be afraid. What did you see? See, Saul saw nothing. What did you see? And the woman said to Saul, I saw a spirit, a demon, ascending out of the earth. And so he said to her, what is his form? So again, Saul sees nothing. That witch sees something in her mind. And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, but the word was is not in the Hebrew. See, that's added by the translators. Saul perceived that it, and then you have to add a word, appeared to be, pretended to be Samuel. And he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. And Samuel said to Saul, now this demon pretending to be Samuel is saying to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? So in other words, he's creating this scenario as if Samuel is still alive, even though he's dead and he's in the underworld and something like that. It's all a big deception, a demonic deception. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me and does not answer me anymore, neither by prophets nor by dreams. And therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I should do. Do you really believe that God would bring up Samuel, or allow Samuel, the real Samuel, to be brought up in this seance by a witch after he refused to answer Saul through prophets? And Samuel said, this demon pretending to be Samuel, why then do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemies? In other words, now he's playing that game, the demon is. And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, namely David, because you didn't obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done the thing to you this day, and moreover the Lord will also deliver Israel with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. You see, here this demon is telling the truth. Saul and his sons would die in battle. And so sometimes demons know the truth. They know the future. But you never know when they tell you the truth, when they tell you the error, when they tell you deception. And of course, apart from that, we are not supposed to at all ever get in contact with demons. Never ever should we try to do that. Saul was not willing any longer to obey God in any manner, shape, or form. And so he even went to a witch to be told the future. And when we now go to 1 Chronicles we see how Saul died. First Chronicles, and for instance, why he died. Yes, with what he did to Agag and the Amalekites was part of it, but it wasn't the real reason, not the final reason. See, that's where the deception even of that demon came into play. First Chronicles, chapter 10. Let's first read about his death in verse 13. First Chronicles 10 and verse 13. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness, which he had committed against the Lord, because he didn't keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. Very clearly put. But he did not inquire of the Lord. Now, we read he did. Not really. It wasn't really in his mind. You see, he did it as a pro forma kind of a procedural thing, but he didn't care. He wanted an answer, no matter where the answer came from. And so we read, he consulted a medium for guidance, didn't really inquire of the Lord. Therefore, he killed him. God killed him. And he turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Now let's read about his death, beginning in verse 1 of 1 Chronicles chapter 10. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons. And the Philistines killed Jonathan. So Jonathan died too in that battle. And then the other sons, Abinadab and Malchushiah, or something like that, Saul's sons. And the battle became intense against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was wounded by the archers. And then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. And therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. So he committed suicide. And when the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died. And so Saul and his 3 sons died. All his house died together. And when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw that they had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled. And then the Philistines came and dwelt in them. And so it happened the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor, and sent words throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. And then they put his armor in the temple of their gods, and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon, that terrible fish god. And when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, and they brought them to Jabesh and buried their bones under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. A terrible ending of Saul, which actually now included his own sons, which included Israel. You know, they still followed Saul. They probably shouldn't have in these battles. But you see, it's a terrible story if you really think about it. Here's a man who had everything going for him. A most handsome guy, taller than everybody else. Started very good with humility. Became angry, became mad, became envious, became plagued by a demon, and then ultimately ended up consulting a witch. And that's why God killed him. So if you want to summarize what we learned today in a few words, Saul failed because he became proud. Lucifer failed because he became proud. Many human beings fail because of their pride. He failed because he was more concerned about what people wanted than what God wanted. He took matters in his own hands. He decided for himself, in the face of danger, what to do and how to worship God. Think of the sacrifices. Think of Agag, the Amalekites. He made a foolish vow. Think of his son Jonathan and the honey. He made promises which he continuously broke. Now that's called lying in the Bible. And God tells us that no liar will be in God's kingdom, that they will end up in the lake of fire unless they repent of this it's a terrible character trait. You see, if a person keeps lying, God can never rely on what that person is going to do. He became envious, suspicious, angry. He sensed conspiracies all over. That led to hatred. It led to attempted murder. And it led to mass killings. He stole. He took David's wife, gave her to somebody else. And he finally participated in a seance with a witch, leading to his death and the death of his sons and many of his people. A man who could have become a great hero in the Bible became one who, from everything we can see, has committed the unpardonable sin and will end up in the lake of fire.